The mother-in-law called in early December and said she was expecting them for New Year's. It was 1972, the village of Medvedskaya, just outside Krasnodar. And Victoria, honestly, didn't want to go, but her husband Andrei insisted. Grandma had to see the grandchildren before the holiday. Family duty, the way things are supposed to be. So around the 20th of December, she packed their things, took both sons, 7 and 10 years old, and headed to the village. To put it mildly, Valentina Nabokova was known for her difficult temperament. People in the village were afraid of her. The neighbors tried not to cross her path without good reason. Victoria knew this better than most because she was Andrei's second wife and understood perfectly well why his first marriage had fallen apart. But it was the holidays, the grandchildren were expected, it was the right thing to do, and she didn't argue. Andrei helped pack the bags, walked her to the door, and told her as she left to be careful. She took her sons by the hands and walked out. That same day, she called her husband from the post office in Medvedskaya. She said they'd arrived safely. The mother-in-law had met them. Everything was fine. And that was the last time Andrei heard her voice. Valentina Nabokova, 59 years old, had lived in Medvedskaya her entire life, and everyone in the village knew her. She had never accepted her daughter-in-law, not from the very beginning, and she didn't even try to hide it. Victoria was from a different background, an outsider, not the woman her son needed. That was her opinion, and she made it known to everyone. Andrei tried to smooth things over, but his mother wouldn't listen. Then the grandchildren came along, 2 boys, and Valentina seemed to soften. She stopped showing open hostility. She started inviting them to visit, sending gifts. Victoria, though, never fully believed it. She remembered too well the way her mother-in-law had looked at her in the early years. But for the sake of her sons, for the sake of her husband, she endured it, visited, smiled. Victoria arrived with her sons on December 30th. The mother-in-law calmly fed them after the journey, showed them where to sleep, all as usual. Victoria exhaled. It seemed like things would be fine. They were expected back within a week. The school break would be over. Victoria was supposed to return to her job at the school, and her sons were supposed to be back at their desks, but nobody came back. Andrei waited a day, 2, 3, and no word. There was no way to call. Mobile phones didn't exist back then, and you couldn't just run to the village post office. He figured maybe they'd just stayed a little longer, maybe the boys were having fun at Grandma's, or maybe the roads were snowed in, or something else. A week passed, then another. Victoria was missing work, the boys were missing school, and no one had sent word, no one had given any notice. Complete silence. Victoria's relatives started to worry, started asking Andrei where she was, and he himself didn't know. He couldn't understand what was happening. This kind of silence was completely unlike his wife. She always let him know if plans changed, and so in January, it became clear that waiting was no longer an option. Andrei gathered himself and went to Medvedskaya to find out what was going on. Valentina opened the door and looked at her son calmly, as if she'd been expecting this visit. Andrei asked right away, "Where's Vika? Where are the boys?" She shrugged and said they'd visited for a short while and left, gone to Turkmenistan, to Victoria's relatives. She said it was warmer there, they wanted to wait out the winter. She'd walked them to the bus stop, waved goodbye, and hadn't seen them since. She said it matter-of-factly, without a trace of concern, and didn't even ask in return, "What happened? Why are you even asking?" Andrei stood on the doorstep and couldn't make sense of it. Victoria had never mentioned Turkmenistan to him. There were no plans, no conversations about it. To leave for months without telling her husband, abandoning her job, that was completely unlike her. Unlike anything, really. He asked when they'd left. She said almost right after the holidays. He asked why she hadn't called. She shrugged again, said it wasn't her business. The daughter-in-law was a grown woman. She could make her own decisions. Andrei looked around the yard, the house. Everything seemed normal on the surface. Nothing out of place. Only inside, it was empty. No voices of his sons, no belongings. His mother looked at him evenly, expressionless, just waiting for him to leave. He left, but not for home. Andrei went to the police that same day and filed a report. His wife and sons were missing. He'd last seen them in December. His mother-in-law claimed they'd gone to Turkmenistan, but he didn't believe it. Officers made inquiries and contacted Victoria's relatives in Turkmenistan. The answer came back quickly. No one had come. No woman, no boys. They hadn't been expected and hadn't been seen. In January 1973, a criminal case was opened for disappearance under unknown circumstances. They began checking, interviewing every bus driver who had passed through Medvedskaya in the first days of January, routes to Krasnodar, to Timashevsk, to other stations. They showed photographs. No one remembered a woman with 2 boys, not a single match. They also asked specifically whether an elderly woman had come to see someone off, maybe with luggage, with bags. No. The drivers knew Valentina Nabokova. It was a small village. Everyone knew everyone, but no one had seen her at the bus station during those days. And that's when the mother-in-law's story started falling apart. Victoria and her sons hadn't gotten on any bus. No one had seen them off. They hadn't left. Investigators went through the village, questioning neighbors and acquaintances, everyone who lived near Nabokova's house. And things started coming to the surface. One person recalled that on the night before New Year's Eve, thick smoke was pouring from the chimney of Valentina's house. Not the usual kind from a wood stove, but different. Dark, heavy, as if something had been burning for a long time. The fire had been going for hours, even though the night wasn't particularly cold. Others had heard noises, first shouting, loud, sharp, then screams. They couldn't tell whose, but there was definitely more than one voice, and some kind of crashing, as if something had been falling. One of the neighbors even said it sounded like someone had been banging on something as if calling for help. Investigators asked why no one had gone outside, why no one had called the police. Silence. And then an honest answer. They were afraid. Nobody wanted trouble with Baba Valya. Who knows? Maybe it was a family matter. They'd sort it out themselves. They didn't sort it out. The investigation drew its first conclusion. Victoria and her sons had arrived in Medvedskaya on December 30th. That was confirmed. They had not left the village. That was also confirmed. On New Year's Eve, screams were heard and strange smoke was seen coming from the mother-in-law's house. The conclusion was obvious. A search was conducted inside Valentina's home. The first theory investigators were working was straightforward and, frankly, typical for cases like this. She had done away with them and concealed them in the cellar. That's what many had done before. Her own house, her own property. No one would come looking. The neighbors were afraid, and in winter, even though the ground was frozen, it was still warmer in the cellar. With enough effort, you could dig a hole. The officers went down and started digging. They worked methodically, layer by layer, checked every corner, every section of the floor, tapped the walls looking for hollow spaces, any sign that something had been hidden there. Nothing. No bones, no fragments, no traces on the ground or walls, no telltale odor of decomposition. Even though only a few weeks had passed since the disappearance, and if something had been there, it would have been noticeable. The earth was just earth, dense, compacted. No signs it had been recently disturbed or dug up. They went through the entire cellar down to the foundation, lifted every layer. Empty. The investigators came back upstairs. Valentina had been watching the whole time, calm, not nervous, not asking questions, not saying, "What are you looking for?" or "Why?" Just standing there waiting for them to finish. The cellar theory didn't hold up, but the investigators knew the remains had to be somewhere. 3 people can't just vanish without a trace. They didn't dissolve into thin air, and so they began thinking about where else to look. The next theory they pursued involved the garage, a concrete floor. If you pour fresh concrete on top, no one would notice. In winter, it sets quickly, and it becomes, essentially, the perfect place to conceal something. They brought in equipment and started breaking through. Jackhammers cracked the concrete into chunks. Beneath it, earth was exposed, and officers dug deeper. Half a meter, a full meter, checking every section, literally centimeter by centimeter, because they understood that if something was there, they couldn't afford to miss it. The work went on for several days straight. They removed the entire floor, sifted through the soil beneath it, screened the earth, looking for anything at all, and again, nothing. No signs of a burial, no disturbed earth, not a single clue to suggest anything had happened there. The concrete turned out to be old, untouched for years, and beneath it lay undisturbed soil that clearly hadn't been dug, not in December, not in recent years at all, empty again. Valentina continued to say nothing and behaved as if none of this concerned her. During interrogations, she repeated the same thing. They left for Turkmenistan. I don't know where they are. Look for them yourselves. 2 theories checked. Both dead ends. The investigation began to stall because without the remains, the case was essentially falling apart. But there was still one place they hadn't checked. Near the village, a small river flowed, shallow, silty, with a slow current. In winter, it didn't freeze completely. The investigators understood that if something heavy were thrown in, the silt would pull it under, sediment would cover it, and finding it later would be extremely difficult. They decided to check the river too. They brought in equipment, sent in divers, combed the bottom under the bridge, downstream, in areas where something might have washed up against the bank. They used specialized equipment to dredge the silty bottom and bring up anything that could be reached. The work went on for days. The result was the same. Nothing. Not a single find, not a single lead. After that, they searched the tree lines around the village. They covered the fields, inspected abandoned buildings, old wells, pits, everything that could serve as a place to conceal something, and everywhere, empty. 3 people, a woman and her 2 sons, had vanished without a trace. They hadn't left. That had already been established. They hadn't walked away on foot. Someone would have seen them. They weren't hiding with someone they knew. That had been checked too. And they weren't in any of the places where things are usually hidden when someone wants to cover their tracks. The investigation had hit a wall. They continued to interrogate Valentina. She was called in again and again, asked the same questions in different ways. She answered the same every time. I don't know anything, I didn't see anyone, I walked them to the bus stop, and that's it. She didn't contradict herself. She held herself as though none of this concerned her at all, as if they were talking about strangers, not her own daughter-in-law and grandchildren. Valentina was detained and placed in a pre-trial detention facility. The interrogations began, long, exhausting, but she held firm. When asked directly whether she was responsible for what had happened to them, she answered just as evenly, I didn't touch anyone. If you have doubts, find the evidence. From the very first days, an attorney appeared at her side. Where the money for a defense lawyer came from was unknown, but the attorney was experienced and set the strategy immediately. Stay silent. Admit nothing. Explain nothing. Don't engage with the investigators. No evidence, no case. Let them search and prove it themselves. And Valentina stayed silent. During interrogations, she repeated her rehearsed answers. In her cell, she didn't talk to anyone. Operatives placed informants near her, people whose job was to get her talking, gain her trust, extract something, anything, even the smallest detail. It didn't work. Nabokova held like iron. Not a word about that night, not a hint about what happened in her house on New Year's Eve. The defense attorney's strategy was working flawlessly. By September 1973, the case had been stalling for 8 months, and it was a complete dead end. Andrei arranged a visit with his mother. He sat across from her in the visitation room, looked her in the eyes. She looked somewhere off to the side, past him, as if he wasn't even there. He asked directly, quote, 3? Silence, quote, 4. And again, nothing. Not a word, not a movement, as if she couldn't hear him at all. He said he knew it was her, that he understood. Valentina didn't deny it, didn't make excuses, didn't say the things people usually say in situations like that, things like, quote, 5. She just stayed silent, lowered her eyes, and waited for the allotted visitation time to end. Andrei came back again, and again, and again. Each time he asked the same questions, and each time he got the same answer. Silence. He didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't try to pressure her. He just asked, already knowing there would be no answer. He asked because there was nothing else he could do for his family. The investigators watched these meetings and hoped that maybe, just maybe, she would tell her son. Maybe she'd crack, because this was her own child. She didn't crack. Valentina stayed silent as if behind that silence stood a wall, solid without a single crack. Then the case was transferred to a new team. Viktor Shtyogol was appointed lead investigator at the Krasnodar Regional Prosecutor's Office, and David Goldberg became the head of the investigation as deputy chief of the investigative division. They studied all the materials, everything that had been gathered over those months. Search protocols, neighbor statements, interrogation results, a map marked with every location that had been searched, every place they'd checked, everywhere they'd gone. The conclusion they reached was grim. The remains would most likely never be found. Valentina had concealed them so well that conventional methods couldn't reach them, or had disposed of them so thoroughly that continuing to search was simply pointless. But Shtyogol and Goldberg made a different decision. If they couldn't find what they were looking for, they would have to prove it without it. They would build a chain of circumstantial evidence so that the picture came together on its own, so that everything pointed in one direction, and the court couldn't dismiss it. It's important to understand that in the Soviet Union, no one had ever done this before. A criminal case involving loss of life without the key piece of evidence, without what usually serves as the definitive proof in such investigations, this was a true legal experiment. There was no precedent. No one knew whether it would work. But there were no other options, because releasing Valentina meant closing the case forever. And so they started over, but with a different approach. Stop looking for where things were hidden. Start looking for what was left behind. Shtyogol and Goldberg began with the house. It had already been searched, but now they were looking differently. Not for what's usually sought in cases like this, but for traces, any traces that might have remained. They checked every corner, every crack, every object, methodically, centimeter by centimeter, because they understood that if anything was still there, it would be concealed so as not to catch the eye. And they found something. Deep under a bed, against the wall, lay a crumpled fur coat. Next to it stood a pair of boots, winter boots, warm. And these were the very items Victoria had been wearing when she arrived in Medvedskaya in late December. They had been shoved so far back that during the first search, they were either missed entirely or no one had looked carefully enough. Something else. Now they looked with different eyes. The fur coat, the boots, the daughter-in-law's winter clothing, all of it, inside the mother-in-law's house. And here a question arose that Valentina's story had no answer for. If Victoria had left for Turkmenistan, why did she leave her winter clothes behind? It was late December, cold, freezing. So what did she travel in? Slippers? And why was the fur coat crumpled and stuffed under the bed rather than hung in the closet? Not left carelessly, hidden, as if someone wanted it to never be found. The story about the departure fell apart completely. This wasn't an accident or forgetfulness. It was a lie. But for the court, this still wasn't enough. Abandoned belongings alone don't prove that something terrible happened. They needed more. They kept searching. The yard, the outbuildings, every corner, anything that could provide even the smallest lead. Among the tools, the kind every household has several of, one detail immediately caught the eye. The handle had been recently repainted, bright blue, fresh paint, clearly applied over something. And here the question arose, why would anyone paint the handle of a yard implement? Wood doesn't rot fast enough to require urgent repainting and aesthetics for a yard tool. That would be a very strange concern. No one usually bothers with that. The only reason it would make sense to repaint the handle was to cover up what had been on it before. Some kind of stains, marks, something that had soaked into the wood. The implement was seized and sent for forensic analysis. The criminalists worked meticulously, scraping off layers of paint, examining the wood underneath, searching for any traces of biological evidence, even minimal, even old, that might have been preserved in the pores of the wood. The results were inconclusive. Not enough for a definitive finding. The paint had done its job and destroyed most of what might have been there. They didn't get direct proof. The implement was added to the chain of evidence. The picture was beginning to take shape, not yet from complete pieces, but already into something coherent. The forensic team continued working inside the house, searching for biological traces, anything that might have remained on surfaces, in cracks, in places that are difficult to clean completely, even with great effort. And they found something. A partial fingerprint, small, smeared, but still readable, found in biological trace evidence. And most importantly, the size of the print was clearly not that of an adult. The print was sent for analysis and compared with samples, with belongings of the missing persons, with materials from the Krasnodar apartment where Victoria's family had lived. The result came back. Definitive. The print belonged to one of Valentina's grandsons. Her grandson's biological trace evidence in her own home. And this wasn't a scratch, not an accidental cut, not some everyday mishap you could explain away as a child's carelessness. This was a mark that should never have been there, in a house where, according to its owner, everyone had left alive and well, gotten on a bus, and headed for Turkmenistan, and this changed everything. Now it wasn't a question of whether they had left or not. Now it was an established fact. Something had happened in this house, and the evidence belonged to one of the missing. The chain was complete. The case went to trial. Shiogol and Goldberg had prepared everything they could. Over 30 expert analyses, forensic, biological, trace evidence, every piece was documented, examined, and confirmed by specialists. Victoria's fur coat and boots, hidden under the bed, the implement with the repainted handle, the fingerprint belonging to the grandson found in trace evidence, neighbor testimony about the events of New Year's Eve, statements from the bus drivers, the response from Turkmenistan. It was a chain of circumstantial evidence, link by link, and not a single piece of direct proof among them. But together they formed a picture that could not be explained any other way than by what had happened that night. David Goldberg personally presented the prosecution's case. The trial lasted several days. Valentina sat in the defendant's seat with the same expression she'd worn during every interrogation, calm, detached, as if all of this was happening to someone else. Goldberg presented the evidence. Piece by piece, analysis by analysis, he built the entire chain so that each link reinforced the next, so the picture came together on its own. The defense attorney pushed one point. Where was the key evidence? Without it, there was no confirmation that anyone had come to harm at all. Maybe they left. Maybe they were in hiding somewhere. Circumstantial evidence was not established fact. The court withdrew to deliberate. When the judges returned, the courtroom went still. Guilty. 15 years of imprisonment. That was the maximum sentence for a woman under Soviet law. They simply couldn't give more, even given the severity of what she had done. Valentina heard the verdict in silence. She didn't flinch, didn't lower her eyes, showed no reaction at all, just nodded to the guards and stood up. The defense filed an appeal. The Supreme Court of the Russian Soviet Republic reviewed the case but upheld the verdict without changes. During the investigation, Andrei told the investigators something he had kept silent about before, something he himself hadn't wanted to remember for a long time and had tried to keep buried deep inside. Victoria was his second wife. He had also visited his mother with his first wife, long ago when he was still very young. He'd brought his wife and their newborn daughter. He wanted to show Grandma her granddaughter, the way families do. The baby cried a lot, as all infants do at that age, but Valentina found it irritating and didn't hide her displeasure. She said the baby was noisy, that she was a bother, that she wouldn't let anyone rest. And then one morning, the young parents found their daughter in her crib. She wasn't breathing. Doctors arrived and determined the cause was suffocation. Back then, they called it sudden infant death syndrome. A tragedy, but these things happen. No one was at fault. Andrei's first wife didn't believe that explanation. She accused her mother-in-law to her face. Said, "It was her. She did this." Andrei didn't believe his wife at the time. How could you think something like that about your own mother? The family fell apart after that. And now, after everything that had happened, he remembered that story and finally understood that his first wife may have been right. Investigators dug deeper, pulling old case files and checking Valentina's past. It turned out she had been under suspicion before. Her 5-year-old nephew had passed away under mysterious circumstances, then an elderly relative. And every time, the same pattern. Nothing was proven, cases were closed, and she remained untouched. Valentina Nabokova served her full sentence, all 15 years from the first day to the last. She was released in the late 1980s, old but unbroken, and returned to Medvedskaya, to the very same house where it all happened. Neighbors saw her on the street and said she looked the same as before, silent, heavy, with that same gaze that made you want to look away. A year later, she was gone. She never uttered a single word about what had happened, not at trial, not in prison, not after her release. What took place on New Year's Eve of 1972 stayed with her, and she took that secret to the grave. Victoria and her sons have never been found. More than 50 years have passed, and in all that time, not a single bone, not a fragment, not a trace of a burial has been discovered. 3 people vanished, and the earth has never given them back. What remains of this story? A fur coat and boots hidden under a bed, an implement with a repainted handle, a fingerprint found in trace evidence. That's all that's left of a family that came to visit Grandma for New Year's. The house in Medvedskaya still stands, and so does the secret. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel. See you next time.